James Madison is my ninth cousin 4 times removed. James Madison Jr. was born on March 16, 1751 at Belle Grove Plantation near Port Conway in the colony of Virginia to James Madison Sr. and Eleanor Rose Conway Madison. His family had lived in Virginia since the mid-17th century. Madison's maternal grandfather, Francis Conway, was a prominent planter and tobacco merchant. His father was a tobacco planter who grew up on a plantation then called Mount Pleasant, which he inherited upon reaching adulthood. With an estimated 100 slaves and a 5,000-acre plantation, Madison's father was among the largest landowners in Virginia's Piedmont. In the early 1760s, the Madison family moved into a newly built house that they named Montpelier. Madison grew up as the oldest of 12 children, with 7 brothers and 4 sisters, though only 6 lived to adulthood. Of the surviving 3 brothers, Francis, Ambrose, and William, and 3 sisters, Nellie, Sarah, and Frances. From age 11 to 16, Madison studied under Donald Robertson, a Scottish instructor who served as a tutor for several prominent planter families in the South. Madison learned mathematics, geography, and modern classical languages, becoming exceptionally proficient in Latin. At age 16, Madison returned to Montpelier, where he studied under the Reverend Thomas Martin to prepare for college. Unlike most college-bound Virginians of his day, Madison did not attend the College of William and Mary, where the lowland Williamsburg climate, thought to be more likely to harbor infectious disease, might have strained his sensibilities concerning his own health. Instead, in 1769, he enrolled at the College of New Jersey, later renamed Princeton University. His college studies included Latin, Greek, theology, and the works of Enlightenment. Emphasis was placed on both speech and debate. During his time at Princeton, Madison's closest friend was future Attorney General William Bradford, along with fellow classmate Aaron Burr. Madison undertook an intense program of study and completed the college's 3-year Bachelor of Arts degree in 2 years, graduating in 1771. Madison had contemplated either entering the clergy or practicing law after graduation, but instead remained at Princeton to study Hebrew and political philosophy under the college's president, John Witherspoon. He returned home to Montpelier in early 1772. Madison's ideas on philosophy and morality were strongly shaped by Witherspoon, who converted him to the philosophy, values, and modes of thinking of the Age of Enlightenment. Biographer Terence Ball wrote that at Princeton, Madison was immersed in the liberalism of the Enlightenment and converted to 18th century political radicalism. From then on, James Madison's theories would advance the rights of happiness of man, and his most active efforts would serve devoutly the cause of civil and political liberty. During the 1760s and 1770s, American colonists protested tightened British tax, monetary and military laws forced on them by Parliament. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which caused strong opposition by the colonists and began a conflict that would culminate in the American Revolution. The American Revolutionary War broke out on April 19, 1775, and was ended by the Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783. The colonists formed three prominent fractions: Loyalists, who continued to back King George III of the United Kingdom; a significant neutral fraction without firm commitments to either loyalists or patriots; and the Patriots, whom Madison joined under the leadership of the Continental Congress. Madison believed that Parliament had overstepped its bounds by attempting to tax the American colonies, and he sympathized with those who resisted British rule. Madison hoped to minimize the abuse of the majority rule. Additionally, navigation rights to the major trade routes accessed by the Mississippi River highly concerned Madison. He opposed the proposal by John Jay that the United States concede claims to the river for 25 years, and according to historian Ralph Ketchum, Madison's desire to fight the proposal was a major motivation in his to return to Congress in 1787. Leading up to the 1787 ratification debates for the Constitution, Madison worked with other members of the Virginia delegation, especially Edmund Randolph and George Mason, to create and present the Virginia Plan, an outline for a new federal constitution. It called for three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial; a bicameral Congress consisting of the Senate and the House of Representatives, appropriation by population, and a federal council of revision that would have the right to veto laws passed by Congress. Dolley Payne is my 10th cousin 4 times removed. On September 15, 1794, Madison married Dolley Payne Todd, the 26-year-old widow of John Todd, a Quaker farmer who died during a yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. Earlier that year, Madison and Dolley Todd had been formally introduced at Madison's request by Aaron Burr. Burr had become friends with her when staying at the same Philadelphia boarding house. After an arranged meeting in early 1794, the two quickly became romantically engaged and prepared for a wedding that summer. But Todd suffered recurring illnesses because of her exposure to yellow fever in Philadelphia. They eventually traveled to Harwood in Virginia for their wedding. Only a few close friends, only a few close family members attended, and Winchester revered Alexander Balmain presided. Throughout his life, Madison's views on slavery were conflicted. He was born into a plantation society that relied on slave labor, and both sides of his family profited from tobacco farming. While he viewed slavery as essential to the Southern economy, he was troubled by the instability of a society that depended on a large slave population. Madison also believed slavery was incompatible with American revolutionary principles, though he owned over 100 African American slaves. Madison grew up on Montpelier, his family's plantation in Virginia. Like other southern plantations, Montpelier depended on slave labor. When Madison left for college on August 10, 1769, he arrived at Princeton accompanied by his slave, Swanee, who was charged with Madison's expenses and with relaying messages to his family back home. In 1783, fearing the possibility of a slave rebellion at Montpelier, Madison emancipated one slave, Billy, selling him into a 7-year apprentice contract. After his manumission, Billy changed his name to William Gardner, married and had a family, and became a shipping agent, representing Madison in Philadelphia. In 1795, Gardner was swept overboard and drowned on a voyage to New Orleans. Madison inherited Montpelier and its more than 100 slaves after his father's death in 1801. That same year, Madison was appointed Secretary of State by President Jefferson, and he moved to Washington, D.C., running Montpelier from afar, making no effort to free his slaves. As was consistent with the established social norms of Virginia society, Madison was known from his farm papers for advocating the humane treatment of his slaves at Montpelier. He instructed an overseer to treat the Negroes with all the humanity and kindness consistent with their necessary subordination and work. Madison also ensured that his slaves had milk, cows, and meals for their daily food. By the 1790s, Madison's slave, Swanee, was an overseer of part of the plantation. Madison ordered Swanee by letter to ready fields for growing apples, corn, tobacco, and Irish potatoes. Like Swanee, some slaves at Montpelier could read. Enslaved people at Montpelier worked 6 days a week from dawn to dusk with a midday break and got Sundays off. Paul Jennings was a slave of the Madisons for 48 years. Jennings, born into slavery in 1799 at the Montpelier plantation, served as Madison's footman at the White House. In his memoir, A Colored Man's Reminiscences, of James Madison, published in 1865, Jennings said that he never knew Madison to strike a slave, although he had over 100, neither would he allow an overseer to do it. As a house slave, Jennings had a basic education and was literate, taught in mathematics, and played the violin. Although Jennings condemned slavery, he said that James was one of the best men that ever lived, and that Dolley was a remarkably fine woman. Madison called slavery the most oppressive dominion that ever existed, and he had a lifelong abhorrence for it. In 1785, Madison spoke in the Virginia Assembly favoring a bill that Thomas Jefferson had proposed for the gradual abolition of slavery. And he also helped defeat a bill designed to outlaw the manumission of individual slaves. As a slaveholder, Madison was aware that owning slaves was not consistent with revolutionary values, but as a pragmatist, this sort of self-contradiction was a common feature in his political career. Historian Drew R. McCoy said that Madison's anti-slavery principles were indeed impeccable. Historian Ralph Ketchum said, although Madison abhorred slavery, he nonetheless bore the burden of depending all his life on a slave system that he could never square with his Republican beliefs. There is no evidence Madison thought black people were inferior. Madison believed blacks and whites were unlikely to coexist peacefully due to the prejudice of the whites, as well as feelings on both sides inspired by their former relation as oppressors and oppressed. As such, he became interested in the idea of freedom, or freedmen, establishing colonies in Africa, and later served as the president of the American Colonization Society, which relocated former slaves to Liberia. Madison believed that this solution offered a gradual, long-term, but potentially feasible means of eradicating slavery in the United States. Madison nevertheless thought that peaceful coexistence between the two racial groups could eventually be achieved in the long run. Madison was one of two major influences in Jefferson's cabinet, the other being Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin. Madison was appointed Secretary of State despite lacking foreign policy experience. An introspective individual, he received assistance from his wife, relying deeply on her in dealing with the social pressures of being a public figure, both in his own cabinet appointment as Secretary of State and afterward. As the ascent of Napoleon in France had dual Democratic Republican enthusiasm for the French cause, Madison sought a neutral position in the ongoing coalition wars between France and Britain. Domestically, the Jefferson administration was the Democratic-Republican Congress, and the Democratic-Republican Congress rolled back many Federalist policies. Congress quickly repealed the Alien and Sedition Act, abolished internal taxes, and reduced the size of the Army and Navy. Gallatin, however, did convince Jefferson to retain the first bank of the United States, though the Federalist political power was rapidly fading away at the national level. Chief Justice John Marshall ensured that Federalist ideology retained an important presence in the judiciary. Madison's inauguration took place on March 4, 1809, in the House Chamber of the U.S. Capitol. Chief Justice Marshall administered the presidential oath of office to Madison while ongoing President Jefferson watched from a seat close by. Vice President George Clinton was sworn in for a second term, making him the first U.S. president to serve under two presidents. Unlike Jefferson, who enjoyed relatively unified support, Madison faced political opposition from previous political allies such as Monroe and Clinton. Additionally, the Federalist Party was resurgent owing to opposition to the embargo. Aside from his planned nomination of Gallatin for Secretary of State, the remaining members of Madison's cabinet were chosen merely to further political harmony, and according to historians Ketchum and Rutland, were largely unremarkable or incompetent. Congress had repealed the Embargo Act of 1807 shortly before Madison became president, but troubles with the British and French continued. Madison settled on a new strategy that would designed to pit the British and French against each other, offering to trade with whichever country would end their attacks against American shipping. The gambit almost succeeded, but negotiations with the British collapsed in mid-1809. Seeking to drive a wedge between the Americans and the British, Napoleon offered to end French attacks on American shipping so long as the United States punished any countries that did not similarly end restriction on trade. Madison accepted Napoleon's proposal in the hope that it would convince the British to finally end their policy of commercial warfare. Notwithstanding, the British refused to change their policies, and the French reneged on their promise and continued to attack American shipping. With sanctions and other policies having failed, Madison determined that war with Britain was the only remaining option. Many Americans called for a second War of Independence to restore honor and stature to their new nation, and an angry public elected a war-hawk Congress, led by Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. With Britain already engaged in the Napoleonic Wars, many Americans, including Madison, believed that the United States could easily capture Canada, using it as a bargaining chip for other disputes or simply retaining control of it. Although the overall result of the war ended in a standoff, the quick succession of events at the end of the war, including the burning of the Capitol, the Battle of New Orleans, and the Treaty of Ghent, made it appear as though American valor at New Orleans had forced the British to surrender. This view, while inaccurate, strongly contributed to bolstering Madison's reputation as president. Native Americans lost the most, including their land and independence. Napoleon's defeat at the June 1815 Battle of Waterloo brought a final close to the Napoleonic Wars, and thus an end to the hostile seizure of American shipping by British and French forces. When Madison left office in 1817, at age 65, he retired to Montpelier, not far from Jefferson's Monticello. As with both Washington and Jefferson, Madison left the presidency a poorer man than when he came in. His plantation experienced a steady financial collapse due to price decline in tobacco and his stepson's mismanagement. In his retirement, Madison occasionally became involved in public affairs, advising Andrew Jackson and other presidents. He remained out of the public debate over the Missouri Compromise, though he privately complained about the North's opposition to the extension of slavery. Madison had warm relations with all four of the major candidates in the 1824 presidential election, but, like Jefferson, largely stayed out of the race. In his later years, Madison became highly concerned about his historical legacy. He resorted to modifying letters and other documents in his possession, changing days and dates, and adding and deleting words and sentences. By his late 70s, Madison's self-editing of his own archived letters and older materials had become almost an obsession. As an example, he edited a letter written to Jefferson criticizing Gilbert du Montier, Marquis de Lafayette. Madison not only inked out original pages, but in other correspondence, he even forged Jefferson's handwriting. Historian Drew R. McCoy wrote that during the final 6 years of his life, amid a sea of personal financial troubles that were threatening to engulf him, at times mental agitation issued in physical collapse. For the better part of the year in 1831 and 1832, he was bedridden, if not silenced, literally sick with anxiety. He began to despair of his ability to make himself understood by his fellow citizens. Madison's health slowly deteriorated through the early to mid-1830s. Approaching the 4th of July, he died of congestive heart failure at Montpelier on the morning of June 28, 1836, at the age of 85. According to one common account of his final moments, He was given his breakfast, which he tried eating but was unable to swallow. His favorite niece, who sat by to keep him company, asked him, "What is the matter, Uncle James?" Madison died immediately after he replied, "Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear." He was buried in the family cemetery at Montpelier. He was one of the last prominent members of the Revolutionary War generation to die. His last will and testament left significant sums to the American Colonization Society, Princeton, and the University of Virginia, as well as $30,000 to his wife, Dolley. Left with a smaller sum than James had intended, Dolley suffered financial troubles until her death in 1849. In the 1840s, Dolley sold Montpelier, its remaining slaves, and the furnishings to pay off outstanding debts. Paul Jennings, one of Madison's younger slaves, later recalled in his memoir, "In the last days of her life, before Congress purchased her husband's papers, she was in a state of absolute poverty, and I think sometimes suffered for the necessaries of life. While I was a servant to Mr. Webster, he often sent me to her with a market basket full of provisions, and told me whenever I saw anything in the house that I thought she was in need of, to take it to her.